A series on the book of Psalms. The Psalms seem to echo emotions that resonate in all generations. The Psalms speak to us where we live, in the daily grind, the conflicts, in struggles. And they remind us that God is in control. The Psalms, as it were, are a reality check. And each pastor has chosen a psalm to share with you as we worship week by week. And I've chosen Psalm 23. Oh, really? Psalm 23? It's for old people, retirees who have been put out to pasture, whose friends are dying off, blah, 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 blah. But Psalm 23 is one of the most recognized passages of Scripture, and it is considered to be the most favorite of all Psalms. Bear with me. Have you ever experienced chaos? Have you ever experienced stress? I've been watching. I've been listening. Last week, a young couple was walking out of church, and I had noticed as they sat there together, they were missing their toddler. And as they passed me, I remarked to the fact that their toddler was not with them. And the young mother's face lit up. "It's been wonderful," she said. "The grandparents took him after Sabbath school, and I was able to sit in the service and use my adult mind to listen to the whole sermon. It's been wonderful." Parenting. Talk about stress. The joys of a little one, the crying, the nuclear gagging diaper changes, the never-ending feeding, and all you want is sleep. Just a little. The 4 a.m. feeding of the newborn is done, and she's finally asleep. You drift off to grab a few winks when suddenly you realize the 2.5-year-old is awake and hungry, slid out of bed, went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, is now standing by your bedside, thrusting a cold jar of pickles at you to open for him so he can eat. Wisely, you choose not to let him eat pickles at 5 a.m. And you get him back to sleep and back in bed. And hopefully, as you slip back under your covers again, you can sleep. The alarm goes off at 6. The day starts with a mad rush to get the 8-year-old to school on time with homework done and lunch in hand. As some of you know, parenting can be quite chaotic, and it's far from a breeze. And then there's the chaos of politics, the chaos of the loss of work, the need to look for a new job, or you still have your job, but you're working with difficult, selfish, foolish people. Work pressure builds. There's the uncertainty of when are we going to have a new senior pastor? What will they be like? Do you know who they are? And it's into this mix of a world of stress and chaos and anxiety and sleep deprivation that we turn to Psalm 23. It's an ancient profession of sheep herding that begins, as the psalmist expresses it, with a pastoral setting. It begins slow and calm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And as I listen to these words of David as he's expressing this, you can see the pressure beginning to slip away from him. And then all of a sudden he begins to realize the impact of what is taking place, and the intensity arises again. He turns to the view from the sheep. And he has this phrase that most of us pass off and say, this is a psalm for the dead. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Because the phrase death is there, we have assigned this psalm to its specific role. But I would suggest to you today that there is a different way of understanding the message of the psalmist. Let me explain. There's a woman named Temple Grandin who has lived her life and is living her life with autism. Her specialty is agriculture, especially dealing with animals. And watching a movie of her life, I was amazed as she specifically was assigned to do research in the slaughterhouse process. Not a very happy place for people to be. What she did was to begin to look at the process of the slaughterhouse from the eye of the cattle. They noticed that as the animals would go into the slaughterhouse, they would have an anxiety level and things would begin to change. There was a almost panic that would begin to set in. And as she began to go down and look and see and know, and knowing how animals see, what she realized was that animals, the cattle that were being taken into slaughter, view life through eyes that do not see color. They are black and white. And as they were heading through the chutes, the shadows of light would play, and the animals would respond in fear. Wow. I immediately thought of Psalm 23. The valley of the shadow of death. So I began to look up quickly, what do sheep see? How do they see? When a sheep is going through this valley of shadows, what is it that's taking place? And what I discovered is that sheep have similarized to other cattle in that they only see in black and white. They do not see in color. Furthermore, if you look at the sheep, at the structure of the head and the placement of the eyes are in each side of the head. And the sheep can see 340 degrees. Movement almost behind them is identifiable. It's almost the whole world. Can you imagine as humans if we could see 340 degrees? And as I began to look at that, I began to realize for the first time David knew how sheep saw. He understood, and what he was describing was not the experience of death. He was describing about the living of life. When the shadows are cast and we do not know what is behind those shadows, and they represent danger, and therefore we go to fear, almost as it were to scare us to death. We use that terminology. I discovered to my horror that it actually can happen. When my children were young, two eighth-grade boys in elementary school, decided to spend the weekend together at one of the boys' homes. They got permission from the parents. Everything was set. They had had a good day Friday night. They'd had a good day Sabbath morning and during church and Saturday night. Sunday morning about 1 o'clock, they came up with the idea that they were going to take the father's motorcycle out for a joyride. And the two boys got on the motorcycle and started driving out in the country of Michigan in the dark roads where there were no cars. And they, I am sure, were thrilled. As they went through an intersection, they saw that there was a police car waiting at the intersection, and the boys panicked and immediately began to accelerate. The officer sitting there watching a motorcycle go by simply saw that it had two passengers on it, but noticed that it immediately began to accelerate, and he said, "Something is going on there. I'd better follow and make sure." He came upon the scene. They were both dead. They lost control on a curve. And the cause of death, scared. There were no fatal injuries to the bodies. I didn't know it was possible. I just thought it was an expression, but it can happen. And there are times in life when we become scared, as it were, to death. And what the psalmist is talking about is not the dead and what happens to that. He is talking about the experience of being frightened and being threatened and uncertain of how to respond. Where the psalm starts out calmly and it then begins to build with intensity, we find that life is not all roses, it's not all gentle waters and beautiful pastures. There are thorns, there are surprises, there are unexpected turns, and there are children, and there are babies, and there's sickness. But we can still have confidence in the shepherd. He watches us, he leads us, he cares for us, he protects us. David started out in a calm way, and then you could see the excitement build as he's coming to this experience of the sheep and all of the stresses of life that come along, and David can't contain himself any longer. And so suddenly in this psalm of a pastoral scene with shepherd and sheep, he breaks out, he bursts out. "You prepare before me a table in the presence of my enemies." Suddenly we're taken from this scene of pasture and sheep and calmness, and we understand even there are difficulties. David is not talking about bombs from drones or flying planes or long-distance missiles or rockets. David is talking about the ancient way of fighting in battle, where it was hand to hand, sword to sword. It was ancient warfare. And the absurdity of a sudden stop in the battle, where God sits him down at a table and he provides a feast for him. And he anoints him to indicate he is God's chosen. And his cup runs over. The dichotomy of this scene begins to tell us exactly where David's heart is and the struggle that he's having and what he views about God. As you know, I keep talking about our trip to Thailand. We supposedly went in the cool, dry season. It was always in the 80s and 90s, and it was still very humid, even though they said it's so dry. One day we had decided to go down into the city of Bangkok, and so we had piled all 7 of us into my son's Toyota 4Runner, It was a 7-passenger. They have those there. It was amazing. But anyway, 7 passengers, so we all fit in. We took place. We went to town, and we were coming back, and we were going from the city and some sight touring to a place called Bangsai so my wife could do some more shopping, and we were in the process of getting it. Traffic was heavy. It was hot. There was air conditioning, but we were crowded in, and we were touching each other when you ride along, and you just can only stand that for so long. And it was not a very comfortable time, and the bounciness and the traffic. To my relief, one of my grandsons finally says, "Dad, I have to use the restroom." So we pulled off into a gas station. We piled out of the car, could stretch our legs, begin to experience blood flow in places where it had not been flowing. I could go into the gas station and I could buy my snacks. They have strawberry-flavored Oreo cookies in Thailand. I could buy a drink. And I sat waiting for the others to finish and get ready to pile back into the car. And I was sitting there in the shade for a few moments when Martha came along and she brought me a drink. She said, "I decided that you might like this. It's green tea, iced green tea with honey lemon and boba." I took it, just saying thank you. I appreciate that. And then I put the big straw down through, and I began to drink, and I had no idea how thirsty I was. I had not realized. And now in my mind, as I think of this psalm and I listen to my cup running over, it is as though I have this unlimited supply of green tea iced with honey, lemon, and boba that just keeps coming and coming and coming. We have a shepherd who, in the middle of chaos, difficulty, stress, sets a table, reminds us that he chose us, and he refreshes us with a never-ending cup, and he satiates our appetite. Following this burst of reality, David then concludes, "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The Apostle Paul was very familiar with the Psalms. And as I was contemplating this particular psalm, all of a sudden a verse from the Apostle Paul came to mind. It's found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I'll begin with verse 16. For the Lord himself, it's talking about the coming of the Lord. The apostle is writing. He says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words." Our Adventist hearts are reminded again, we have no need of fear. We do not have to be concerned about the dangers that lurk and what is coming next. We have a shepherd who leads us, who protects us, who rescues us. The reality of life on this earth is shattered by his coming. And as David said, and we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.